Hi friends, my name is Michelle Fondin and I'm the author of Help, I Think My Loved One is an Alcoholic, a survival guide for lovers, family, and friends. Today I'm going to talk to you about what is alcoholism. I believe there are still many common misconceptions surrounding the disease of alcoholism, and most people in the mainstream really have no idea what the disease of alcoholism is and what it entails. I believe that many people still consider it to be a moral failing, which it very much isn't. So let's begin with a little bit of history of alcoholism. Researchers and medical professionals as early as 1784 talked about alcoholism as a disease, but it wasn't until 1933, shortly after Prohibition in the United States, that alcoholism was recorded as an actual disease. So what is alcoholism? Alcoholism is classified as a physical, emotional, spiritual, and social disease. So let's explore that a little bit. So alcoholism is a physical and/or chemical disease. So alcoholism affects a person on a physical level. It actually attacks the reptilian brain in the limbic system. So that is our primitive brain. That part of the brain is responsible for our survival. So it's survival of the species. It is that part of the brain which compels you to drink water, eat food, and procreate. So the alcohol in your body, if you are prone to getting alcoholism as a disease, or if you drink on a daily basis as a heavy drinker, as your body chemistry changes, then you can suffer from the disease of alcoholism. So actually what alcohol does is that it attacks the reptilian brain. So it attaches itself to that survival aspect of your brain that says you cannot survive unless you consume alcohol. Now this desire to consume alcohol will supersede even the need for drinking, eating, or procreating, which are the three most basic survival aspects of our species and why we've survived for hundreds of thousands of years. So it actually changes your brain chemistry when you become an alcoholic. It also changes the brain chemistry to affect your sense of well-being. There are neurotransmitters in the brain that signal to you that you're well, that you're surviving, that you're happy, that you're whole. And some of those neurotransmitters are referred to as dopamine. There's another neurotransmitter, serotonin. Especially the neurotransmitter dopamine, what happens is that when you do something pleasurable, the dopamine levels are naturally high. So you might have something as referred to as a runner's high when you go for a run, or you might have a dopamine high when you have sex, or you might have a dopamine high when you eat something that's pleasurable, such as chocolate. What alcohol does is that it interrupts the patterns of dopamine in the brain. So as you consume more and more alcohol, what it does is that alcohol naturally elevates the dopamine levels in your brain. And it signals to the body, to the limbic system, to lower the amounts of dopamine that your body would naturally produce on its own. So that is why alcohol is also a depressant, because when you stop drinking alcohol the next day or several days later, your sense of well-being is rather low, and you can even experience symptoms of depression. As the alcoholic continues to drink, so they drink and their dopamine levels are elevated by the alcohol. Then when they come off the drinking, their body has already received the signal not to produce any more dopamine. So pretty soon that neurotransmitter dopamine is completely shut off, and the only way to restore those levels of dopamine is to consume more alcohol. Do you see now this vicious cycle that starts to occur in an alcoholic on a physical and chemical level? There are other neurotransmitters in the brain that are also affected. So serotonin, as I mentioned, again, you hear the word serotonin in reference to depression. So alcohol also interrupts the patterns of serotonin in the brain. So again, naturally lowering the levels of serotonin, and so that the alcoholic needs to consume more alcohol in order to artificially raise the levels of serotonin. Another thing that the alcohol does is that it attacks the prefrontal cortex. So as the alcoholic progresses in his or her disease, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for your sense of judgment and knowing what's right and what's wrong. It's also impulsive control. So impulse control is really important when you're trying to make a decision for your well-being. If you tend to spend a lot of money on your credit cards and buying those shoes or buying that new coat, and you have a hard time controlling yourself, think about an alcoholic. So now the alcohol has attacked his limbic system, his sense of survival. In his brain, it says you cannot survive without alcohol. Then it attacks the prefrontal cortex. So now his judgment is completely off. So instead of saying, no, I can't have that drink, the prefrontal cortex doesn't allow him to make that good judgment call. It is attacked so that he can't tell right from wrong. He can't tell I should drink this and not that. He can't really discern from his prefrontal cortex, maybe I should stop drinking, maybe I've had too much. And so it really becomes this vicious cycle of the brain telling him he needs more alcohol and his prefrontal cortex telling him, well, you should be making this judgment, but you really can't, so drink more alcohol, and so on and so on. So hence the progression of the disease. So since alcoholism is largely a brain disease, you can imagine that it also affects the person's emotional health. If you can think about it, when you have spent too much on credit cards, or you've bought too many shoes, or you've eaten that whole chocolate cake, or you haven't had the willpower to exercise, for example, you know the kind of self-talk that occurs inside of yourself. You feel shame, you feel guilt, you feel blame, you get down on yourself. Imagine what's happening in the brain of the alcoholic. He doesn't understand what's going on. He doesn't get the fact that alcohol is attacking the brain, it's changing brain chemistry, and it's forcing him in a way to consume more alcohol. But on the outside, he starts to see that he's not like other people. He starts to see that, hey, I don't behave, I don't drink like a lot of other people drink. It starts to wreak havoc on his mental well-being. And so he starts to think like, I'm not like other people, I'm not as good as other people, I'm not worthy. And then he starts to feel guilt and shame inside of himself, and that really builds up. So it really affects and attacks his mental health. I mentioned that alcoholism is a spiritual disease too. And it's really that lack of connection to a higher power. It's that lack of connection of faith to a higher power that really gets the alcoholic in trouble. Now, some of you may be scratching your heads and going, okay, that doesn't sound very medical. It doesn't sound like a medical explanation. Well, I'm a holistic healthcare practitioner, and I can tell you that if you look to the other side, if you look to the recovery side says that in order to establish full recovery, you need a spiritual awakening. And you can call that spirituality whatever you want for it, and that is certainly a topic and a subject for many other videos in this series. But right now, for the definition of alcoholism, let me suffice it to say that when the alcoholic is stuck in himself, he becomes extremely self-centered. And you may even experience this as someone who loves an alcoholic. He internalizes the problem most often. He becomes very self-centered, very wrapped around himself. Everything has to do with him and himself. And it's, like I said, it's this vicious cycle that keeps spinning around and around and around, and he doesn't understand how to get out. So the lack of spirituality, the lack of hardcore faith in a power higher than himself is really something that helps him to stay sick. Next is alcoholism is a social disease. It is a social disease because the alcoholic relies on others to help him get large amounts of alcohol to feed the addiction. So remember, you've got to remember his brain chemistry is completely changed. So inside of his head, it's like, get more alcohol, get more alcohol, get more alcohol, get more alcohol. Well, alcohol costs money. And the effects of alcoholism, the effects of the drinking, sometimes eventually allow the person to not be able to work and not be able to make money and not be able to earn money, or maybe spend more money on alcohol than spending it on bills, or spending more money on alcohol than spending it on food. So the alcoholic relies largely on other people to help enable his addiction, to help enable his disease. And this might be where you come in as well, as someone who loves an alcoholic. The nature of the disease, as I mentioned, is physical and chemical, emotional and mental or psychological, spiritual, and social. It's very unique in that sense, where it's a disease that is multifaceted and multi-layered. And for that, it's a very, very unique disease. Let's talk a little bit now about how alcoholism is classified as a medical disease. So let's look at that. Alcoholism is considered to be a chronic lifestyle disease. Now, other chronic lifestyle diseases are diabetes, heart disease, obesity, stroke, cancer. So if you look at chronic lifestyle diseases, they are diseases that are directly impacted or grow directly through a person's lifestyle choices. So alcoholism is classified as a chronic lifestyle disease. Let's look at the word chronic a little bit. So chronic means that the disease is ongoing. So without an interruption in the pattern, without a way toward recovery, the disease will continue on and on and on and on and on. So as long as the alcoholic continues to do what he does, the disease will progress and continue. So a chronic disease is also progressive. Progressive means that over time, the disease will get worse and worse. And so that goes for any chronic disease. As the disease progresses over time, it will get worse and worse. So that works with diabetes, that works with heart disease, that works with high blood pressure, that works with obesity. So we're looking at this as a chronic and progressive disease. Lastly, alcoholism is a fatal disease. Left untreated, alcoholism is fatal. When you think about the disease of alcoholism, you need to think about it medically. You need to think about it as a disease. It most certainly is not a moral failing. I don't know a single alcoholic who would choose the life of alcoholism. I don't know a single alcoholic who would choose to drink copious amounts of alcohol and never get better. Let's look at this from a chronic disease, progressive disease, and fatal disease. Left untreated, all alcoholics will die of alcoholism or an alcohol-related illness. So that is the definition of alcoholism. The alcoholic, again, will have a higher tolerance level as he drinks more and more alcohol, which will require him to take in more amounts of alcohol. He will continue to drink regardless of the consequences of his illness. So those consequences may be finances, relationships with children. It might mean that he loses his job. It might mean that he loses his home, loses material goods. It might mean that he continues to drink even in the consequences that are physical. So he may have physical ailments and may still continue to drink. So that is what it is. Now, the other side of it, as I mentioned, is recovery. So let's look at how do we stop a chronic, progressive, and fatal disease from happening. The only way in which you can stop a chronic, progressive, and fatal disease is to do a course correction. So if you stay on the same path as an alcoholic, you will eventually die of alcoholism. That is an absolute certainty. You can be absolutely certain of it. So the only way through it is to do a course correction. Now, a course correction for an alcoholic is full-on recovery. Full-on recovery means abstinence from alcohol for the rest of your life. Now, certainly there has been talk in the media, there has been talk in medical circles about managed or controlled drinking. I can assure you that if somebody is an alcoholic, managed and controlled drinking does not work. Because as we think about the definition of alcohol, it is chronic, progressive, and fatal. So managed drinking does not work. The brain is completely modified by the chemicals in alcohol, and the only way to heal the brain, to reverse the damage done by the alcohol, is to abstain from the chemical of choice. Now, be wary. I said recovery. Recovery means abstaining from any and all mind-altering substances. This doesn't necessarily have to mean alcohol. It does mean alcohol, but it can also mean prescription pills that are brain-altering or brain-modifying, including pain-killing medications, which are referred to as opioids in some categories, ADD medication, anti-anxiety medication, and certain antidepressants. So be very, very careful if you have alcoholism in your family, if you have the disease of alcoholism, or if you love an alcoholic. Be wary about something called switched or crossover addiction. This also includes drugs that are street drugs. This also includes things like NyQuil and over-the-counter medications such as Tylenol PM, or anything that has a PM or anything that has a cough suppressant in it. Be wary. Those are all crossover addictions and will do exactly the same thing to the brain chemistry of an alcoholic as the alcohol itself. So the only pathway is to recovery. Now, recovery simply does not mean abstaining from alcohol. It also means being in a recovery program. So you need to think about the process and the problems and the brain thinking that led the alcoholic to drink in the first place. And if the alcoholic was healthy and whole prior to taking in alcohol in copious amounts over a sustained amount of time, let's just suppose the alcoholic, like many in my book, they had a happy childhood, they had a happy upbringing. There are still personality flaws and personality traits that lead someone to drinking in copious amounts over a sustained amount of time. And the second thing is that even if the person was mentally healthy prior to becoming an alcoholic, the years of alcoholism certainly ravaged his or her personality and ravaged his or her mental state. And so recovery through the 12 steps, through a recovery program, is the only way to restore sanity and to be able to start that normal thinking like a normal person. So I hope you've enjoyed my explanation and definition of alcoholism. I look forward to seeing you again in the next video. God bless.